Okay, so story point estimation kind of stinks, but why? What's so bad about story point estimation? Well, it all kind of comes down to this idea that I mentioned in that last clip. Story point estimation is supposed to be fast and efficient, but somehow it never actually seems to work out that way. So you're supposed to be able to just quickly estimate a lot of stuff and toss it into these buckets and not worry so much about if it's a 3 or a 5 or a 5 and an 8 or whatever. You're just going to try to say, okay, this is tiny, this is small-ish, this is large, whatever. Move through a whole bunch of stuff and quickly get to a pretty good estimate. So on that idea, don't worry too much about the difference between a 3 and a 5, or a 5 and an 8, or a 2 and a 3, or a 1 and a 2. You're supposed to be making these estimates quickly, and you're not supposed to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the difference is between these buckets. It's supposed to be relatively straightforward, get to the answer quickly. But somehow teams still always end up spending a ton of time debating sizing, debating how big these things are, or how small they are, or comparing a 2 to a 3, or a 3 to a 5, or a 5 to an 8. You're not supposed to do that, but it somehow always happens. And that wastes a lot of time. So right there, strike one. Now, I'm going to make a prediction. Your bosses and your stakeholders are not that technical. So they're going to ask you a question like, when's it going to be done? And then what you're going to do is you're going to answer in the language of the team. And the language of the team is story points and velocity. How complicated is it? How much effort is it? That's your story points. How fast can you clear out story points? That's your velocity. So someone asks you the question, when's it going to be done? And then you answer with blah, 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 blah. Story points, it's 6 story points. The average velocity is 7.29. And then da, 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 da. It's going to be a couple sprints because yada, yada, yada. Right? You ever had that happen? You know exactly what you're talking about. But when you try to explain what those story points actually are, you confuse the heck out of your stakeholders and your bosses and your customers. And they zone out because story points and velocity are really abstract. And the conversation always ends up somewhere like, I don't care, just tell me when it'll be done. I don't need to know about story points and velocity. And ultimately the problem here is that story points and velocity are just really hard to explain. And you just had trouble explaining it, and just like that, a little bit of your credibility goes up in a puff of smoke. Because probably more often than not, those stakeholders, your bosses, your customers, hear all that junk you're saying about story points and velocity. They have no idea what you're talking about, and they think you're probably trying to trick them into thinking that something's better than it actually is. Not great. Now, I'd heard this quote, if you're explaining you're losing, for a really long time, and I finally got around to looking up who it is and who said it, and it seems like Ronald Reagan said that in one of his books. If you're explaining, you're losing. Now, whether you like Ronald Reagan or not, doesn't really matter. He does have a point. If you're trying to explain something and you're spending tons and tons of time explaining it, and the person you're talking to or the people you're talking to don't get it, well, you're probably not succeeding at what you're trying to achieve. Now, if I'm working with a team or an organization, one of the things that I really want to do is I want to build a relationship. I want to build up a rapport with the customers, stakeholders, executives, whatever. I want those people to think of me and think of the team as a bunch of co-equal humans. And when I'm doing that, I want to have time to talk about things that matter. Questions about requirements, feedback on requirements, feedback on the designs, possible approaches, things the team has completed in the past. But really, I just want to get to know them as humans, and I want them to know me as a human. So things like, do they have kids? Do they have hobbies? What kind of vacations do they like to take? Do they have any coming up? What are some things they're proud of? Things they're looking forward to? Things they're excited about? Things that you have in common. If I have to spend a ton of time constantly explaining and re-explaining story points and velocity, then I don't have as much time to talk about things that matter. And at that point, I've fallen into that hole where if I'm explaining, I'm losing. And the problem is that story points and velocity are just really hard to explain. So strike two. But all this stuff with story points are totally worth it because your estimates are amazing, right? Yeah, sure. That sounds perfect. Nailed it. Not true. There's a ton of variability in any of our estimations. So if you're using story points and velocity, your estimates probably still stink, even if you're good at doing story points and velocity. There's just always going to be a lot of variability. Our estimates are almost always going to be wrong. And even if you do it right, even if you're good at story point estimation and velocity, it still is going to take your team a lot of time. You're going to be spending lots of time estimating rather than doing. And the thing to remember is that estimates don't deliver much value. And your customers don't really care about your estimate about when something's going to be done. They just want it to be done. Because done working software actually delivers value. So if you're doing a whole bunch of estimating, basically something that doesn't deliver a heck of a lot of value, then that's probably waste. Now, I know you're going to say, but we need it. We need our estimates so that we can tell people when they're going to get their stuff. But remember, our estimates and getting all those story point values, they're hard to do, it's hard to explain, they're probably wrong, and they have limited business value. Ask yourself if you're doing it just because you've always done it that way. Or you're giving estimates because you always have given estimates. Or you're doing estimating because that's what everyone has always done. But at the end, when we look at it, it really has limited business value. So right there, that's strike 3. And that wraps it up for story points and velocity. Which then begs the question, what comes next? And the answer is flow metrics. And that's what we're going to cover next.